Hello there. The War Within got off to what was probably the strongest start of any expansion since Legion, with an almost universally positive response. And there's no doubt that many of us were starting to hope that this could be the start of something great. But that's a first impression. It is of course impossible to judge a World of Warcraft expansion by just the start. With the War Within's first content patch on the verge of releasing and the Season 1 content in full swing, it's a great time to start to check in and see how things are progressing. One of the major reasons for that positive reception was Delves, which certainly seemed to have the potential to offer an alternative to the traditional big three of Raid, Mythic Plus and PvP, something that the WoW dev team have attempted in the past, but without much success. At launch, I found Delves to be a major step up from those previous attempts. Clearly learning from the past, Delves seemed to offer much more variety and repeatability than things like Island Expeditions or Torghast, and the reward system that was inspired by the successful Mythic Plus format looked like it has the potential to at least offer some level of meaningful progressing. The pre-season weeks limited us to level 3, whose relative lack of difficulty did make it hard to get a good handle on how that progression would work out in progress. But even early on, we started to see what in hindsight were signs that we as players are approaching Delves in a way that the designers had not expected. One of the biggest concerns that I had was the bountiful Delve key system. Previous attempts to throttle access and link content together using earnable keys had never landed well in World of Warcraft, and players quickly decided that using what was framed as a scarce resource during the pre-season would be a mistake. The end result? Many of us started to hoard keys, effectively rendering the pre-season Delves pointless to do, with a knock-on impact on the World Soul Memories event, which also required items, again basically keys, from the Delves in order to do. At the same time, another potentially problematic player narrative arose, one which framed doing 8 level 8 bountiful Delves in week 1 of the season as a mandatory target. Now at the time, we really had no way of knowing if that was even going to be possible, but the idea nevertheless gained a lot of traction, and this is perhaps where things started to go a little bit wrong. Pretty much everyone who had experienced previous solo and small group systems like Horrific Visions and Torghast were expecting that it would be easier to do a delve in a group compared to solo, but I don't think any of us foresaw how much easier it would turn out to be. At launch, solo delves were seriously challenging, and achieving that goal of doing 8 solo delves in week 1 was clearly going to be a pipe dream for many players. But this was not the case if you were willing to group up. Form a traditional 5-man group for a delve, and that same level 8 delve was much closer in difficulty to a normal dungeon, i.e. yeah, you might fail 1 or 2, but you were going to get there and it wouldn't be particularly hard to do it. In my view, this gap in difficulty was so large that it was a major miss in Blizzard's part that was not detected in testing. WoW is a massive game and balancing it is a near impossible challenge, so some level of difference was to be expected, but this could and should have been spotted internally and avoided before launch. Blizzard, to their credit, did react very quickly, but that speed may have also been their downfall. Group delves were significantly tuned up in difficulty, overtaking solo delves, which were only very slightly tuned down. This created a situation where for many players, your ability to complete that player-created goal of 8 bountiful delves in week 1 depended if you get round to doing them early enough in the week. That's clearly not a tenable position, so Blizzard had to react quickly again, greatly tuning the difficulty of both solo and group delves downwards. The end result, for most players, completing an 8 turned into just a bit of a time grind. It wasn't super fast, but unless you were a priest or a mage, you had a pretty good chance of being able to do it. The problem with this, of course, was that levels 1 to 7 were immediately rendered irrelevant for anything but leveling or doing achievements. Gameplay wise, I still do enjoy delves as a whole, but after a few weeks and getting a bit more gear, the end bosses are starting to lack threat, turning into a fairly simplistic damage sponge where I never really feel challenged, but I still have to spend a bunch of time burning their health down. If you've ever soloed a recent raid boss, you'll know that feeling. Except with the delve, there's no real enrage timer or one-shot mechanic to end your run. Now, for players who play solo, or maybe who wanted an escape from Mythic Plus, getting a full row of heroic gear in the vault every week is a major boost to their character progression. But for players who prefer a bit of a challenge and the feeling of getting better and pushing further over time, that was a major draw for Mythic Plus, this is probably not the end result that they'd want from Delves. And it feels very unlikely to me that this is what Blizzard wanted either. Now, this does not make Delves bad as an experience, but it does create some issues for what has always been the Achilles heel of previous attempts to create seasonal content for casual players, and that is rewards. The first issue is that getting heroic 613 gear from the vault is pretty easy, especially compared to the amount of effort required to get the same rewards from raiding or Mythic Plus. The end result of this is, of course, that at least for some Mythic Plus and raid players, they now see Delves as a chore they have to do. For solo and casual players, of course, getting heroic gear and meaningful vault access is a major boost, at least in this early stage of the season. But I also have some concerns that this might change for them later on. Upgrading that gear required runed crests, and for folks who only do Delves, the only source of rune crests is those bountiful Delves, and you only get 2 crests every run. And there lies the issue. Doing 8 Delves to fill your vault will only yield you 16 crests. That's just enough to upgrade 1 gear item 1 step, and you have at least 15 items or more depending on class and spec choices, and you have 2 steps at least to upgrade. This means that maxing out all your gear is going to take 28 weeks. Way more than the 20 to 21 weeks of a normal season. In other words, you're never ever going to get to a done state before the goalposts are moved. You're probably not even going to get that achievement that would have unlocked the rune crest discount for your alts. It's hard to say how this will feel in practice, but for players who can do Mythic Plus or Heroic Raiding and who had maybe hoped for an alternative to those, I think those players are going to be very, very disappointed. And with the level 4 to 8 progression path for Delves having been rendered effectively meaningless, for players who enjoy overcoming challenges, that does not seem to be something that Delves are now offering. Small wonder then that some players are starting to complain that Delves are beginning to feel a little bit like another weekly chore. And then there's Zekvir's Lair. In pre-expansion interviews, this was sold as a Mage Tower-esque experience. Now, while Zekvir did offer a decent challenge in both difficulty levels, it very quickly became clear that this was no Mage Tower, which is where things get a little bit odd, as Blizzard then went and nerfed Zekvir. Likely done to reduce the gap between Zekvir and the lower difficulty of Delves, this nerf had another unintended effect, as players very quickly realised that you could use Zekvir as a very fast way to cheese a full Delve row. This was very quickly removed by Blizzard amidst much upset and pushback. While I think that this was the right call by the developers, the fact that players wanted to do 8 runs a week of an encounter that was clearly never intended as repeatable content does speak volume to me. The player narrative for Delves has always revolved around the idea of this being solo content, or a way for solo players to get better gear. With WoW content players being limited primarily to veteran gear with a dribble of champion gear, having a way with a little bit of effort to get a full set of champion gear in a few weeks along with 1 heroic piece, not to mention the crest to upgrade, is without doubt super enticing. I suspect that for many WoW content players, the lack of a real progression challenge will not dampen that enjoyment. While I personally do Mythic Plus and Heroic Raiding, I am nevertheless a lover of open world content, and I'm often at my happiest in-game just stomping through and trivialising that content. One-shotting everything in an old dungeon for a chance at a cool mount is surprisingly kind of fun. But for many players who are perhaps tired of pugging Mythic Plus, or who would prefer to just do stuff with 1 or 2 friends without having to pug to fill gap, and who had hoped for an alternative piece of challenging content, I am not sure that this is going to do the trick, either gear or challenge-wise. More seriously, while it was always to be expected that for higher level players, completing the Delve rule would be almost required for the first couple of weeks, which really is no different to things like the Dragonflight super rares, it appears that the relative lack of challenge to level 8 delves, combining with a significant increase in Mythic Plus difficulty scaling, is leading many players to continue to view delves as a weekly chore that they have, in inverted quotes, to do. And inevitably, that's the source of the same complaints as Torghast and Island expeditions. Now, delves are obviously not the same as those systems. Torghast was the only way to get a legendary, and without that, your character was, by Blizzard's own design, incomplete. In contrast, for delves, once you can do a Mythic Plus and above, or do heroic raiding, all a delve gives you is some extra rolls and gear for your weekly vault. So to a degree, those complaints are unreasonable. But it's not our job as players to be reasonable. Gaming is all about the feels, and so even if that feeling of having to fill the role is objectively wrong, that feeling is nevertheless a valid expression of how the game design is impacting us as players. Now, the big question for me is, where do delves go from here? For the remainder of this season, the current state of delves, I think, is pretty much locked in. Any attempt to meaningfully push difficulty upwards would disadvantage the players who are left behind and generate an entirely justified backlash. But for delves to be more than another Warfront, which ended up as just a way to trickle heroic gear to alts and open world players, I do think that they are going to require a little bit of a rework for the future seasons. And that's going to be a massive challenge for the designers, is overcoming a now baked-in player expectation that nearly everyone can do a full vault of level 8s in week 1 of a new season without completely antagonizing, well, all of us, is not going to be an easy thing to pull off. But I do think that the designers do need to look for some kind of solution, if only to set things up for a more comprehensive reboot for the next expansion. For me personally, I would like to see the team nudge the challenge up a bit by adding some more mechanical complexity to the end bosses. This will be difficult. I suspect that the current simplicity is a consequence of needing to build a boss that every specialization in the game can solo, but it's probably still easier than just applying a flat increase in difficulty. Any increase in difficulty is going to need to be very clearly framed to players in order to overcome that you have to do 8s in week 1 narrative that we will carry into the next season. And that probably means that it's going to have to be achieved by encouraging us into even higher levels of delves, by adding rewards to those levels above 8, which then could be scaled up to compensate. And that's where the more complex boss mechanics could also be brought in, hopefully clearly signalling that this isn't something that you should expect to do in week 1. So how about level 9 and 10 delves offering larger amounts of rune crests, with 11 and maybe a new level 12 offering gilded crests? Tune the drop rate so that a player who's reaching maybe a level 11 around 4 to 6 weeks into the season and a 12 maybe around 6 to 10 weeks in could expect, if they fill their vault every week, to max out their hero track gear, or maybe even spend their gilded crests in some of that mythic level crafted gear. And that, I think, could make things a lot more interesting indeed. Now, at first glance, this does feel like it could potentially have a knock-on effect for Mythic Plus and Mythic Raiders, but my hope is that the usual weekly crest caps will offset that. If you prefer doing Mythic Plus, for example, hopefully you'll be capping out your crests there. And if Mythic Plus progression is tuned to better match player expectations in Season 2, then those caps should make delves feel a lot less relevant to those players. Hopefully in the longer term, this will begin to retrain players that getting the absolute best rewards from delves is going to involve a challenge that needs to be worked on over time, rather than something you just get in week 1. If I had one bit of feedback for the developers, it would be that they do need to be a lot more proactive in setting out their intent for content like this, to ensure that we don't just go away and fill the gap by creating our own narratives about what players should expect in week 1. I do genuinely believe that Delves still have enormous potential to bring seasonal, repeatable content to that part of the WoW audience that doesn't raid or do Mythic Plus, along with those who want an alternative. And while they're already hitting the mark for some, they do still need a bit more iteration, especially around difficulty and depth, but also in reward design. The previous attempts in BF8 and Shadowlands to fill this niche quickly fell afoul of very deeply flawed reward systems, which ultimately led to their failure. While Delve rewards do have their flaws, these flaws are also being magnified by the flaws that also exist in the new Mythic Plus season. Assuming these issues can be addressed, and I do believe they can, if the team continue to apply the agility and desire to iterate that we've been seeing from them of late, what has been an imperfect but still solid start for Delves can be a foundation which can be built upon to ensure that Delves do not suffer the same fate that its predecessors did, which was to be left behind when we moved on to the next expansion. My own personal feedback for the designers is to focus in on providing long-term reward and power progression for Delvers, whose pacing is integrated with the pacing of the big 3 rewards, and not in things like cosmetic Delvers journey tracks, which just drive short-term grind and burnout. But what about all of you? Are you still enjoying Delves, or have they become a chore for you? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting, thought-provoking, or just annoying, then do be sure to let me and the YouTube algorithm know by hitting that like icon. And if you would want to see more from me, or you just want to support the channel, then make sure to hit the subscribe button. Subscribing is by far the best way to support a channel like mine. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.